This is Conspirinormal.
All right, welcome back to Conspirinormal, guys. This is Adam, and Seraphiel is here, and we got two people that are good friends of ours that we are really excited because they have just put out their book that they have co-written, Where the Footprints End, Volume 1, and that is Joshua Cutchin and Tim Renner. Say hello, guys.
Howdy.
Hello.
It's good to have you. And the audience, if anybody that's listening went to the Strange Realities Conference, you got to see these guys present and give a preview of this book back in October.
Yes. That's right. We had a tag team presentation.
Yeah.
And I'm thrilled that Jennifer, who was there at the conference, was like, yeah, I thought hearing your interviews and having been at the conference, like I kind of knew what to expect from the book, but no, it's awesome. And I'm like, yes, that's exactly what I wanted to hear. Because there were a couple of times when Tim and I would look at each other and would be like, are we kind of showing our hand a little bit too much here?
Yeah, I wondered about that too, because, you know, I've heard so many of your interviews and I've talked to you guys about this a lot, but there is a ton in the book, and it's not just only like what I think we're about like 260 pages, something basically like that. And of course, there are more pages coming when you put out Volume 2, but I mean, you guys pack a lot in. Yeah. There's a lot of material, and
there's a lot without being too encyclopedic too.
When you add in the introduction, it ends up over 320, I think, pages actually. Something like that.
And for anybody who thinks the way that I do, I think it's like around 100,000 words. So
yes, and copious notes.
That's
notes and copious citations.
That's part of the Joshua Cutchin brand. It's funny. Tim and I have talked more about endnotes than anybody ever should have to in one lifetime.
So, guys, for anybody that doesn't know, you guys, let's talk about kind of like the origins of this book, Where the Footprints End. Like, why did you guys decide to write this book about kind of the supernatural aspects of Bigfoot?
It needed to be written. It really did. There was so much out there that is skirting this. Now, there's, some authors have certainly mentioned it. Some have very explicitly dove into it, like Stan Gordon, for instance, and Al Berry in his 1973 book, which is just called Bigfoot. He did not avoid it at all, the weird stuff. But the vast majority, I think, of what's been written and what's been just put out there in general, as far as Bigfoot media, whether it be TV shows or podcasts or whatever, has been very biased away from this weird stuff, and it's been very, very biased towards this idea that these are flesh and blood creatures. They're only flesh and blood creatures, and there's nothing else. And many of the cases have been what we call weird washed. They've been, if there's weird elements, they've not been reported. They've been taken out and ignored in favor of the things that make Bigfoot sound just like a big giant monkey.
Right. And you guys call this, we kind of play on this whole thing we've talked about a lot, the extraterrestrial hypothesis, but you guys talk about the flesh and blood hypothesis. FB&H is what you guys call it in the book.
Yes. Also a great name for a bank.
No, FNBH. FNBH.
Yes, very true.
Some people have tried to sort of, because there are different ideas of thought in ufology, and one of the most pervasive is the extraterrestrial hypothesis, the idea that UFOs come from other planets. And in UFO circles, it's very common to just abbreviate that ETH. And people have tried similar things with Bigfoot, but they've always kind of been a little bit tongue-in-cheek. People have talked about like tracks and turds. The tracks and turds Bigfoot researchers. So that doesn't work because it's a little bit. I don't think it's quite dignified enough. And to say nuts and bolts Bigfooters isn't accurate, because Bigfoot I don't think Bigfoot has nuts and bolts. I mean, he probably has nuts, but so that was sort of my answer, is to do the flesh and blood hypothesis, FNBH, and I think that term probably pops up a little bit more in volume 2. Yeah, so that was sort of the shorthand that we tried to introduce early on, and refer to that as we go along.
It's pretty apt, because just like UFOs and aliens, alien abduction, where you have a lot of strangeness, as if a craft from outer space isn't strange enough. You have a great deal of high strangeness. You have a great deal of odd happenings. You have a great deal of things pulled in from encounters, like with ghosts and all this type of thing. That happens in those encounters in the UFO world, just in the same way that it happens with Bigfoot. And we're going to get into that. But Tim, I wanted to ask you, because you start off the book with the idea of the company that they keep.
Mm-hmm.
And let's kind of talk about why that's important to kind of understand that.
Well, that actually was, I think it was Josh who first told me, like, when I was talking about all the weird stuff that surrounds Bigfoot. He said, that was a direct quote from Josh. He said, look at the company these things keep, man. And that really got me thinking about it. And in particular, that chapter concerns 8 to 10 square miles in Delta, Pennsylvania, which is in York County where I live. And it's just packed with weirdness. Like just everything from people holding seances to, and they contacted pirate spirits, which told them there was buried treasure in the area, to tales of like haunted mansions that have orbs that glide down the side of the mansion, and leprechauns that supposedly haunt the grounds, and fairy rings around them, to there's a nuclear power plant within the area, UFO sightings, of course, and tons of Bigfoot sightings, like way too many Bigfoot sightings for an 8 square mile area that span over, by the way, like over 100 years. I mean, they go back to the 1880s, the sightings. So all of that strangeness kind of packed into this one little area, and it's hard for me to believe that there's no connection at all. Now, I can't tell you what the connection is, but I can't help but think that there has to be some sort of connection for all this weirdness to appear in the same place. And likewise, going along with that, it's impossible for me to believe that there's a breeding population of ape men in York County, Pennsylvania. So that figures in with this other weirdness.
Right, because you've got way too much human habitation there, and not enough woods for them to survive in. And all there's this kind of stuff.
If you know the difference between like woods and wilderness, like wilderness is pretty much untouched land. In York County, Pennsylvania, there is no wilderness. We don't have any wilderness. We have plenty of woods, but there's no such thing as kind of like untouched land here. And the idea that there could be a breeding population of giant ape men here is just, I mean, it's laughable, really. It's just absolutely silly. But yet they're seen here all times a year. So if they're nomadic, they're coming through all times a year. Tell me why that is, and throughout time, basically, as far back as I could find, and up into modern day, I'm still getting sightings in the area.
You start off the book with this story, and this is the one that basically like possession by Bigfoot. George Kowalczyk encounter, and this is something I guess from the Stan Gordon material.
Stan Gordon was the primary investigator on that, yeah.
And I mean, this is weird. What happens in this case?
What doesn't happen in this case? I mean,
very true.
The reason we start off the book with that is because I think we agreed, like, if there's one case to best exemplify all the weirdness that goes with Bigfoot, it's probably that one. And it was 1973 in Fayette County, Pennsylvania. And it starts with a UFO sighting, which this UFO is seen in the sky by several witnesses. It lands on a farm. So you have a UFO landing, then you have all these strange sounds associated with it, from buzzing and humming to baby crying. You have bad smells associated with it, like sulfuric smells, or I think burning tires, maybe the guy said as well. there's two Bigfoot creatures that are seen. They're shot at multiple times and hit. And the guy said when he shot at it and hit, it didn't react. So that's what we call shorthand term bulletproof Bigfoot in the book, because there's so many instances of that as well. He said it sounded like firing into a pond or a lake. It just went plop when he shot a bullet into it, didn't react. They had glowing eyes. The investigators were called. Well, the police were called. The police showed up. The policeman said he could read his paper by the light of ring that was left in the field where the UFO craft had either landed or hovered just above the field. So that was still glowing. The investigators arrive. There's a incident with, so the main witness, Kowalczyk, he actually starts like growling and running around and screaming, and his own father said he thought he'd been possessed by the Bigfoot creatures. Eventually he kind of passes out, wakes up later and tells everyone he has no memory of this, but he does remember this like Grim Reaper-like figure that had warned him about, the impending doom of the earth, very kind of UFO contactee kind of stuff. While he was in this Bigfoot trance, apparently, this happened. And later on, this witness was visited by these two people, may or may not be, like Men in Black types. One was in Air Force Blues, and the other was in a suit, he said, who hypnotized him. And they either outright said or at least suggested that they were with Stan Gordon. And years later, Stan Gordon said, "Hey, I want to hypnotize you." And the guy said, "You already hypnotized me," and told him the story of these two people coming about 2 weeks after his sighting that had hypnotized him, and he never saw him again. So there's just this all kinds of weirdness just bound up in this one case.
And that's what I think you did a really good job of, Tim, is that I have read different accounts of that, and I never feel like there's ever really a full accurate account of all the strangeness plus the stuff that happened afterwards. And the way that you were able to sort of, jigsaw all that together is pretty impressive.
Yeah, I used multiple accounts to try to get like the most complete story I could, because Stan tells most of it in his book, and Al Berry tells a good bit in his book, and I thought that was very important because his book is like very contemporary. I mean, it had just happened when Al Berry wrote his book, and so he was, with the information that Al Berry put in his book would have been very fresh at the time, and then some from the Chestnut Ridge movie that Small Town Monsters did.
Yeah, I had a feeling with that case when I was first reading it that it was almost like his mind just snapped because of what he saw. It was just too much for him to handle.
It could be. It's he definitely had a personality change, but there's a before and after with him. And again, this is very much like UFO contactee stuff, where he was not interested in the paranormal or anything like it before, and then afterwards he became very, very interested in that, and expressed psi phenomenon and stuff through his life. So the marked change in him before and after this incident. But Stan has tapes of this. He has tapes of him running around and screaming, apparently, and he's very, very protective of them. I was told by people that you will never hear those tapes, Tim. I've been like trying to lean on Stan, hey, you gotta let me have these tapes. And I've been told by mutual friends who know Stan better than I that it's like, nah, you'll never get those tapes.
Wow, that's crazy. That was a really just interesting case, and it's something that I had never heard before. But also, you talk about the alien contact experience and it being similar. There's also the similarity of near-death experiences too. People experience the same kind of phenomenon after that as well.
Oh, absolutely.
So it's like the transformative experience. So you guys talk a lot about in the book the wilderness Geist phenomenon. And my question is the behaviors that Bigfoot might manifest, and I say Bigfoot in quotation marks, that are kind of similar to a poltergeist. And Josh, you start out with this kind of certain class that the BFRO puts these things in, and how it's Bigfoot is actually never seen in this context.
So I think that the important thing to remember when looking at this is that a lot of the stuff that people report Bigfoot doing, like throwing rocks and like making noises and voices in the forest at night, and having a horrible smell, and making knocks and raps on the trees, with the exception of a wood knock, which I don't think anybody has seen. Have they, Tim? Or I'm sure someone has claimed to have seen it, but it's not something that you hear a lot.
Yeah, I think people have claimed to see both them swinging branches and like them hitting their hands on trees and making a similar sound. It's rare for sure.
But most of these are not only have people seen Bigfoot do them, but they're also, for the most part, primatological attributes, something that primates of all kinds do. So having said that, I thought it was important to reframe some of these Class B reports that the Bigfoot Field Research Organization puts out, which are reports where there's a lot of behavior that seems to suggest the presence of something in the woods, but a Sasquatch is never observed, or just briefly observed. So we're talking about things like people who are out hiking and they see these large footprints and they smell a funny smell and something throws a rock at them, but they never see a tall hairy hominid. And this got me thinking on a line of thought that several other researchers have sort of flirted with in the past, but never really done a deep dive on, which is this idea that all these same things that we attribute to Bigfoot in these reports where Bigfoot isn't seen, these Class B reports, can be completely attributed to poltergeist phenomena. They're the exact same suite of phenomena that you see in poltergeist cases, except they're outside. And I think the reason that nobody's really pursued this, the reason that people hear about a rock being thrown at a hiker and they jump to Bigfoot, is because nobody has really entertained the idea of a poltergeist being outdoors. To my knowledge, there really isn't a real precedent for that in any of the literature. So it got me wondering, how many of these cases, how much of this behavior that people will say, oh, I had X happen to me in the woods and it must have been Bigfoot, how much of that could possibly be attributed to something like a wilderness poltergeist, a Wildnisgeist, as it were. So it's more a thought experiment. I've talked with I talked with Greg Bishop about this. Like, if you go through this book and you expect us to come to some sort of conclusion about what Bigfoot is, that's the wrong way to read it. They're sort of separate, discrete essays playing with different things. I mean, basically the thesis of the whole book is that we don't know what Bigfoot is, but there are a lot of different traditions that speak to behaviors that we attribute to Bigfoot now. So there's a lot of contradictory things between chapters. This particular chapter is playing with the idea that some Bigfoot behavior might be attributed to what is essentially a wilderness poltergeist. Now, whether that means a discarnate spirit that lives in the woods, or that means something along the lines of a traditional poltergeist, which is, psi activity that's manifesting around a focal person, I'm not sure. And I play with some different hypotheses in that regard. But pretty much everything involved in poltergeist activity has a precedent in Bigfoot activity, with the exception of perhaps, starting fires. But you look at descriptions of how poltergeist voices sound, and there's a great Colin Wilson quote that I can't remember off the top of my head, but he talks about how in poltergeist cases the voices start out as these animalistic grunts and this nonsensical jabber, which is exactly what people describe when they think they hear Bigfoot in the woods talking sometimes.
Kind of like the Sierra sounds.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the Colin Wilson quote, well, I'll just look for it here. It sounds like it could be describing the Sierra sounds. They do not sound like ordinary human voices, at least not to begin with. They begin in a guttural voice that sounds as if it were made up from grunts and groans. That's in poltergeist cases, and it sounds just like what we are familiar with Barry and Moorhead Sierra sounds, which, if anybody is unfamiliar, they're very easy to find on the internet. Probably the most authentic, or definitely the most cited recordings of Bigfoot talking in this, what's described as this sort of really guttural samurai chatter. Sort of sounds nonsensical. But you look at the thrown stone phenomena. There are people who have these stones thrown at them and they pick them up and they're warm to the touch. Now, the cryptozoologist, who's in favor of it being a flesh and blood Bigfoot, says, oh, the Bigfoot was holding it in its hand and it warmed the stone. But stones that are warm, that apport out of nowhere, or stones that just show up in the middle of a room and drop to the floor, in poltergeist cases, are almost universally described as being warm to the touch as well. and then you look at something that sort of goes underreported is the appearance of things that look like Bigfoot in seances, which, between a poltergeist infestation and seances, those are your two real focal points for where these poltergeists tend to manifest. So if it didn't manifest on its own around a young person who's probably going through puberty, it would manifest with a medium in a seance. And there are plenty of examples of mediums who manifest these like Neanderthal looking men, or these half gorilla ape men, or these really very hairy hands, all sorts of things like that. So to me, that makes me wonder if there isn't some sort of shared DNA between the poltergeist experience and the Bigfoot experience. So hence Wildnisgeist was born.
Right. Yeah, it's very similar to each other. Like the idea that you guys have said many, many times, that if it's inside a house, it's a poltergeist. If it's in the woods, or it's outside, then it must be Bigfoot. Just that's the general reasoning, and it doesn't necessarily have to be that way.
These phenomena, and this really got driven home to me in a big way, but all these phenomena, all paranormal phenomena, are both setting and culture dependent. Because you'll read some stuff from some cultures that describe witches or hairy ghosts that to us today we're like, no, that was a Bigfoot, but that's just they're viewing it through a specific cultural lens. And like you said, which is what our good friend Soraya has said oftentimes, is that a light in an abandoned house is a ghost. A light in the sky is a UFO, and a light in the woods is, a fairy or some sort of, maybe it's a Bigfoot orb or Bigfoot's glowing eyes, something like that. But it's always this, you can have these things that honestly, a lot of times look and behave almost identically, but because they appear in different areas, we tend to sort of reframe the way that we interpret them. And I think that's right. Something of a problem.
Right.
It's you guys really take a dive into folklore to explore the relationships and similarities to these other phenomenon, because folklore is like the record of all these same types of happenings for however long.
Well, I'm a fan of making this comparison, not because Greg Bishop has slapped my hand for saying this numerous times, and that's not my intent. I'm not trying to compare it in quality, but in terms of like the subject matter and what the book is trying to do, is it's trying to do what Greg Newkirk says on the back cover, which is it's trying to be Passport to Magonia for Bigfoot. Yeah. Jacques Vallée wrote that book in the 60s, and it really made a lot of people pay attention to these older folkloric parallels that really resonated with the UFO phenomena. And, cryptozoology has been so obsessed with the idea that this is a flesh and blood creature that they haven't even really bothered to look at traditions that seem completely unrelated. They haven't looked at, the Western magical tradition. They haven't really looked at, like I said, witches, ghosts, they haven't really sort of tried to make this cross disciplinary interpretation. So I'm not saying that this book is as good as Passport to Magonia. I'm by no stretch of the imagination, but that's kind of the mindset that I think might help people wrap their minds around what the book is about.
Yeah, understanding the importance of folklore, and that a lot of different cultures have got these hairy wild men, or these other characters, these other beings that are very similar. It's saying that like Bigfoot doesn't just come out of a vacuum. It just doesn't come from out there, and it doesn't just start in like the 1950s or whenever people started seeing it in the United States.
That's my least favorite thing, is when you read like a snarky, skeptical Bigfoot article, and they're like, Jerry Crew back in 19, and it's like, no, come on. This goes back way farther than that. It goes back farther than that, and it's a lot more international than that. I mean, something that Tim is the drum that Tim's been banging for a while is that Bigfoot is essentially, an Americanization of the wild man archetype that we've been dealing with. That Westerners have been dealing with way before we ever came over to America.
Right, exactly. Let's get in. I want to get into this about, since we're on the subject of folklore and other kind of beings. Let's get into the fairy encounters and how those are similar to Bigfoot encounters.
Well, I think it was Patrick Harper that said that he's just sort of taken to interpreting Bigfoot as a big hairy fairy, and there are a couple of encounters that you'll find laced throughout the book that have these different aspects. I think it's interesting that people think that they can communicate with Bigfoot through knocks. That was typically a way to summon an opening to fairyland, or a means of communicating with fairies as well. You have this association with not only underground spaces. Fairyland was underground. There's an association with Bigfoot hanging around abandoned mines and caverns, but also this sort of vague, loose association with buried treasure and Bigfoot. Buried treasure and fairies, very well known association. Anybody can just think of leprechauns, but if you look at something like buried treasure and Bigfoot, there are a couple of instances of Bigfoot hanging around and Bigfoot being seen in these state parks that supposedly had treasure buried by, Billy the Kid or something like that. Or, Oak Island has a pretty interesting sleep paralysis Bigfoot story attached to it too. And there's probably no more famous, buried treasure in paranormal circles than the Oak Island treasure. So you've got these sort of peripheral things. A lot of people will say that, fairies are supposed to be small. Well, yeah, but fairies were also inveterate shapeshifters, and there are plenty of cases of shapeshifting Bigfoot. Bigfoot maps on pretty accurately to what Scandinavians would call a troll. There's a great story that I have seen. It was actually also written about in Mark Hall's True Giants, which is a great book, but he whitewashes the hell out of this story. It's actually the story that I opened the Fairies chapter with. It's this 1850s account from Oregon about a boy who was abducted by this tall, 12 to 15 foot tall, hairy man with eyes of fire, who takes him underground to the subterranean layer that's lit up by this indirect light with this domed ceiling. That's made out of this, it's this dome ceiling that's made out of seashells of every size and shape and color. And he hears this disembodied music, and there's a girl who comes up, this beautiful girl who comes up and places, this note in his hand and says, you've got to get out of here, or you're going to be trapped here forever like me and possibly be devoured. And he escapes. Now you take out the Bigfoot, and that's a fairy story. You can find things that are almost identical in the work of Yeats or Crofton Croker or Evans Wentz. I mean, this is this is a pretty clear fairy story, but it's got this Bigfoot creature appended onto it.
Right, because you've got the girl there. They're underground. Where does she come from? Where does she even come from?
Well, yeah. So in fairy stories, that would typically be, described as, if not just a general person, it would usually be like a deceased neighbor or relative who had either died or disappeared, who would come to you and say, "This is what happened to me. You've got to get out of here, and don't eat the food. Leave right now as soon as you can." That sort of thing.
Right, and you also mentioned in that chapter, who we've talked about this with Mark Anthony Wyatt not too long ago, about the knockers. In the mines, and that being underground, and also being the concept of making knocks on objects like Bigfoot does. Talk about the kobolds. I think that's another thing that's underground, if I'm not mistaken.
The one that really blew my mind when I was looking at this, because for anybody who doesn't know, and this is a line that I usually say in every interview when I talk about fairies. Fairies weren't just fairies. They were elves, dwarves, leprechauns, trolls, ogres, giants, mermaids. They all sort of fall under the fairy umbrella, the fairy family, as it were. You can even find people saying that things like basilisks were a type of fairy creature. I don't necessarily go that far. For me, fairies have to be humanoid and have to exhibit some sort of aspect of child snatching or living underground. But mermaids, there's a lot of weird similarities between mermaids and
Yes,
Bigfoot.
there are. Yes, there are. Yeah.
Not only does Bigfoot appear mostly in areas that have strong amounts of rainfall. You can pretty much map those two, put those two maps overlaid on one another. But they're plenty of accounts of Bigfoot jumping in the water and swimming for vast distances underwater, kicking its feet up and down like mammalian aquatic locomotion tends to happen, or like if you think of a mermaid flapping its feet up and down. People who see Bigfoot miles offshore, and of course the skeptical thing is, oh, you saw some driftwood, but there are plenty of it's kind of a known thing in the Pacific Northwest that Bigfoot really likes to swim around and go underwater. There have been people who have been grabbed by hairy arms underneath the water. It's all really kind of wild. If you look at this and you say, well, how does this make any sense? Some European traditions actually placed wild men and wild women as living in the water. To the extent that there's a 13th century German epic called Vigmar that has a wild woman who lives under the ocean who is called the Wildesdip, which sounds like will-o-the-wisp, which it ties back into the lights and such. There are also in indigenous cultures here some people who say that Bigfoot analogs like the Snokwa, who is I believe a Kwakiutl analog for Bigfoot, lives in a palace on the bottom of the ocean. So there are a lot of these really strange things that suggest this aquatic affinity for Bigfoot.
Right. It's another hidden place like underground.
Well, yeah, I mean, don't get me started on like a Patrick Harper sort of interpretation of this about the shadow and the subconscious about being submerged underground. But yeah, you're exactly right. It's all about being subsumed by waking existence. So there's a lot to unpack there, and that's not even getting into the similarities, because I find it so hard to separate fairies and aliens nowadays. Like they completely blur together. Right. And I can make a pretty damn compelling argument if anybody wants to fight me on that. So this isn't even getting to that sort of the center of the Venn diagram that is fairies and extraterrestrials and Bigfoot encounters. In all three, you have livestock mutilation, you have theft of milk, you have basically child abduction. Even some changelings were attributed to wild men in Europe. Missing time happens in Bigfoot accounts. Nobody really likes to talk about it, but there are some pretty prominent people that have had missing time. This motif that I don't think gets nearly enough attention is this idea of the unrousable sleeper. The idea that you hear these stories about people who are abducted and they look over and see their spouse, and their spouse is just laying there and they're beating on their spouse and they can't get them to come up. That happens so often in Bigfoot encounters too. And it's also, something, fairies were often attributed power of sleep over human beings. It's probably where we got the character of the Sandman is probably an evolution of fairy lore as well.
There's also the phenomenon of people seeing Bigfoot or a fairy or an alien or whatever the hell they are, and falling asleep.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Going right back asleep. And that's something that's come up again and again on this show. I know on Tim's show, in your material, Josh.
Yeah. And I've talked too long, so Tim needs to say something. Ask Tim a question. Because I've been around.
I was going to say, Josh, you mentioned earlier Nox as a kind of a summoning. And Tim, you talk a lot about this ritualistic behavior that people exhibit towards Bigfoot in this chapter on gifting. I thought that's some of the most interesting stuff to me.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't see how you can look at gifting to Bigfoot separate from the folklore gifting to fairies or to these other creatures at all at this point. One of my favorite examples is some of the most strident kind of flesh and blood Bigfoot folks will often talk about planting a Bigfoot garden. And they'll say you have your own garden and you don't want Bigfoot to come in and raid your garden, so you plant a special Bigfoot garden that's maybe closer to the trees. And Bigfoot will recognize this as a garden that you planted for him, and he'll leave your garden alone. And Bigfoot will just take from that garden. There is nothing in the natural world that acts like that. Any animals are caloric opportunists. Any natural animal is going to look at that and go, "Oh, now I have two places to eat. Great," So it's this idea of building this dedicated garden just to Bigfoot, and they just do not see it as anything special at all, but I see it as complete intention. You have now, expressed intention as regards to the phenomenon. You've built a special place for Bigfoot. And that's why the Bigfoot is going to that garden, because that's the dedicated Bigfoot garden that you've made. That's your dedicated, kind of altar you've made to Bigfoot. And, so that to me is like one of the plainest examples and one of the funniest, because they just say, well, yeah, Bigfoot just knows that's his garden. Like how would a Bigfoot know?
Well, there's also the fact that, like, if you don't give these offerings to quote unquote Bigfoot, he gets kind of mad.
Well, if you start and stop, that's what they say.
Yeah.
And again, the flesh and blood people say that Bigfoot has now grown dependent on the food that you're offering him. And I mentioned in the book, unless you're leaving wheelbarrows of food, you're not making a dent in the caloric needs of something that big. And if we're talking about a natural animal that's 8 foot plus and probably 1,000 pounds,
right,
it's going to have to eat constantly, and a couple candy bars are not going to make a dent in that thing's caloric needs. So if they disappear, they disappear. But what we're talking about, is an offering. And if you cease to make offerings to spirits, you're in trouble if you start and stop. That's bad news. That's all over folklore. You don't start leaving stuff for spirits and then stop, because then they get mad. Then bad stuff happens. And this is consistent with people saying that, oh, I was feeding Bigfoot and then I got drafted in the army and stopped. And then, my parents had to deal with a crazy Bigfoot on the property who was, beating on their house and climbing on their roof and so forth. It's the flesh and blood folks say, well, it was used to those calories, No, it's very, very consistent with
he's hungry.
Yeah, it's very consistent with folkloric spirit offerings of food. Which is all over the place in folklore. I mean, the simplest one to point to is Santa Claus. We leave him milk and cookies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's a story that you do relate in the book where a guy gets out to where he has been leaving these offerings essentially to Bigfoot, right? And he's been leaving them there, but he forgot his wallet, so he couldn't go buy whatever it was that he was buying for these creatures. And then something really odd happens to him.
Well, first they go
nuts. It's just like physically impossible.
First they go nuts. So, like, as he's in the woods, he was leaving the offerings in a cooler each time. And he said this time he just didn't have anything, so he went and he set up the cooler like he would put the food in the cooler and then leave. And this time he just set the cooler back up as if there was food in it and left without placing any food in. And then he says, like, suddenly the woods go crazy. Sounds like, monkeys screaming. Things start getting thrown. I think he said pine cones were getting thrown at him from every direction. So there's your little wilderness geist activity there. He got screamed at with such force that I think he said it, kind of knocked him to the ground. I think he wet his pants. But anyway, he goes home 50 miles. It's 50 miles away on the two different highways. Goes home that night and goes to bed and is woken up by things slapping the side of his house, which he attributed to Bigfoot. And the host of the podcast that this story appeared on was more of a flesh and blood type guy, and he says he posits these theories. First, he says that it was these different Bigfoot clans that were kind of whispering down the lane to each other, so that until the information got to the Bigfoot in his area to go harass him. Yeah, exactly. And then he said, well, maybe he peed on your bumper, and that's. They were able to track you that way by the smell of the pee.
He propped his leg up on the bumper and just, went to town.
Yeah, exactly. So it's the flesh and blood folks. In order to make this weirdness work in their world where this is a natural creature, they have to build these Rube Goldberg devices like this, where they're like, well, it must have been different tribes of Bigfoot, and they were whispering to each other, hey, go get this guy, until it got to the Bigfoot in his area. It's, like the tiptoeing through the tracks thing where they, the tracks end and they say, well, they turned around and walked in their own tracks. It's like, no, like there's no evidence of that. You just, the tracks would be messed up if that happened. These aren't messed up tracks. In some cases, they're extremely clear tracks almost to a fault. But yeah, they just build these like I call them verbal Rube Goldberg devices. Like, well, the Bigfoot must have done this, and this, in order to reason it as some kind of natural thing that happened, and rather than just stop and say, "Oh, this is really weird. I don't know how this happened." Which is one thing I'd like to point out that we do with this book. We at no point in this book or in Volume 2 will you ever hear us say Bigfoot is an interdimensional creature. Bigfoot is a quantum creature. Bigfoot is an alien. We don't say that. We're very agnostic. Yeah. All we're doing is laying out example after example after example of the weird stuff associated with the Bigfoot phenomenon. And in Volume 1, we're comparing it to Folklore. I did want to mention Volume 2 is a lot less folklore heavy than Volume 1.
Volume 2 is where you find more of the stuff like, disappearing trackways and whatnot. I think I have a list of Volume 2 topics, but here we go. Yeah, so Volume 2 is going to cover. Well, maybe I should talk about what Volume 1 covers first before I talk about Volume 2. So the chapters for Volume 1 are The Company They Keep, Wilderness Geist, Fairies, Aliens, Gifting, Witches, Ghosts, and Women in White, and basically looking at how Bigfoot intersects with all those. Volume 2 is on, the chapters are on the mystery lights, odd vocalizations and mimicry, altered states of consciousness in Bigfoot, which I don't think anybody's really talked about ever, hex signs, oddly numbered toes, disappearing trackways or odd trackways, because there are plenty of weird trackways where it's like just one left foot the entire way, or the trackway stops, like we mentioned, all sorts of weird anomalies. Disappearing evidence, an analysis of Bigfoot through the lens of George P. Hansen's trickster work, and then 2 case studies, which I don't think we've announced, but we might hold those close to our chest. But 2 case studies of some people who have had some really strange Bigfoot activity piling up on them.
So Volume 2 will be kind of more the straight up, this is the supernatural aspects that correspond to all the folklore that you guys have talked about in Volume 1.
Yeah, the rough division is Folklore Volume 1, Evidence Volume 2, which isn't quite accurate because there's plenty of evidence in Volume 1 and there's going to be plenty of folklore in Volume 2, but that's just sort of the rough way that we decided to break it apart. Yeah. It should be emphasized that even though we've obviously staggered releases so that people can wrap their heads around it, this started out as one big book, and they really do go hand in hand. You're going to find references to Volume 2 and Volume 1 and vice versa. It's sort of all meant to be, consumed all at once.
So, Tim, you were talking about this guy in the last case was leaving stuff in a cooler?
Yeah.
Would that be a Yeti cooler?
Boo, go home.
I'm probably going to edit that out. Sorry, guys.
No, you got to keep that in now. You said it. You got to keep that in.
All dad jokes must remain.
Dad, yeah. Dr. Future gets on here and tells a lot of dad jokes, so, they have to remain. Back to some of the more the fairy aspects, because I definitely do want to talk about the women in white. I want to talk about the witch connections. I want to talk about, but I want to hit the berry picking aspects with both fairy lore and now I guess you could call it Bigfoot lore. How berry picking, people doing berry picking will encounter these beings. And then also there's another intersection with the braiding of the horses' manes.
Yeah, so berry picking is one of those things that, a lot of Missing 411 fans will read it and they scratch their heads and go, What's up with all the berry picking? I guess that's Seinfeld reading Missing 411. But
why do people even pick berries?
I know. You go to the supermarket. Yeah. But that is something that has been noticed as the proximity for berry picking, and if you look at fairy lore, especially from Ireland, but also imported into wherever you had Irish settlers settling in the New World, you would find warnings against going berry picking. It was like one of the most dangerous things that you could do was go berry picking because fairies hung around berry bushes. It was just sort of an accepted fact of life. And there's an entire chapter in not one of my books, but one of the books that I own. That's just dedicated to instances of children who went berry picking and had fairy encounters in Newfoundland. So this is definitely something that's ingrained in the part of the culture. But you'll find in addition to this missing 411 thing, in addition to the fact that fairies like to hang around berry bushes, you'll find a strong correlation in the New World with Bigfoot and berry bushes. David Paulides, before he was on the missing 411 track, he was a very sort of grounded Bigfoot researcher, and he was saying that one of the best places to run into Bigfoot was around berry bushes. Now, of course, if Bigfoot's a flesh and blood creature, these represent a good source of calories, but you'd find I think some tribes along the West Coast would describe hairy ogresses that used to hang around huckleberry bushes, and they would steal you if you got too close to the huckleberry bushes. And similarly, people, like I said, to this day will see Bigfoot in Littlefoot, which is a little Bigfoot. A lot of Bigfoot people say it's a juvenile Bigfoot. I point out that a lot of entities in fairy folklore correspond strongly to this Littlefoot entity. But anyway, you'll see Bigfoot and Littlefoot around these berry bushes as well. So it's definitely something that's there's something there. I don't know what it means, but there's something there. The other thing that is really interesting to me is tangled horses' manes. Now, I personally, even though I believe that there's an objective reality to things like Bigfoot and fairies and UFOs, I think that there's something objectively real and non-human going on there. I think that the tangled manes are, for the most part, people who don't, the manes of horses whose owners don't brush them before they, put them in the stables.
Sure.
Having said that, there is a strong tradition in the old world that if you woke up and went out to get your horses and their manes were braided. They would always describe them as braided. These were sort of like makeshift stirrups for the fairies to ride the horses' necks, or sometimes in other traditions, these were for witches. Witches would deliberately braid the manes at night.
They're called witch knots. They're
yeah.
Still today, I believe they're called witch knots.
Now, some people claim that they have found very elaborate braids, and there are some instances of people viewing large hairy hominids interacting with horses, and in a handful of cases, actually, yes, braiding the horses' manes. But having said that, from just a purely interpretive cultural level, this belief that these other entities are the ones responsible for tangling horses' manes has completely trickled down to become its own trope in Bigfoot lore. So now, whereas you'd have someone in 18th century Devon saying that the fairies came and braided our horses' manes, nowadays you'll have George from the West Mifflin Bigfoot Hunters group saying that there's a property a couple of miles down the road that has horses and all their manes are braided. Must be Bigfoot.
Yeah, I always prefer Jim Bear King's explanation as to why the horses' manes were braided.
Oh God, is this that story?
Strange Familiars people have banned me from talking about this anymore, by the way. They've said it's too disturbing.
Well, good. It's been a while since we had him on the show, but his explanation, and I heard him on another show, and I specifically got him on here to Conspirinormal just so he could tell this story, was that Bigfoot is having relations with the female horses, and you've got one Bigfoot on the back end and one Bigfoot on the front end. And he said that he had like, well, one to hold the mane, right? So then the mane gets twisted. That's how it happens.
Yeah, the Bigfoot winds their fingers into the mane. And
that's why Mr. Ed learned how to speak, is so that he could say
oh no,
pulls down on the horse's head.
Nay means no, yeah.
And he said that he had a witness that saw this, and I've always imagined what it must have been like to be that guy. Like,
my question walk out. There's a lot of detail involved in that. There's a lot of detail involved in that account. So someone had to sit there and watch.
There's a little too much.
Yeah. Somebody watched for a long, saying this is true. Someone watched for a long time instead of going to rescue the horse, or I don't know. There seems to be plenty of options other than just sitting there and enjoying some horse rape by the Bigfoot. It's so disturbing.
Tim, I think we might have found some Patreon content for Conspirinormal. We need to do a dramatic reading of that Mary Green Bigfoot book where she describes Bigfoot's member.
There is hours of me and Clint going off on those two accounts, basically, that have never seen the light of day because I can't publish them. They're just too raw.
Yeah. There was something about purple urine or something. Wasn't there something that?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, we'll save it for the patrons.
Okay, we'll save it for the patrons. They'll get something. Reading. They'll get something really special to the patrons on this one.
Oh, this is devolving. We got to get back on track really quick.
Yeah.
Please.
Well, so
we have to edit some of that.
So we mentioned about the aliens, and we talked about how that they are seen, but there's also the phenomenon, and we mentioned that in the first case, especially in Stan Gordon's material. This is all over the place. That Bigfoot is often seen in conjunction with UFOs or flying saucers. Bigfoot is often seen with either anomalous lights or structured craft.
Yeah, that was sort of a sticky thing to try to separate out, because I'm not always convinced that what we call the extraterrestrial contact experience is necessarily should be as tethered to UFOs as it is. Obviously, it appears in some accounts, but there are plenty of accounts where people are taken aboard some other space without ever seeing, a structured craft. They might see lights in the sky, but in terms of like an actual, what we would call, flying saucer or something. So trying to figure out how to address that, because not only is that sort of problematic, but sometimes a UFO might change into a light, and a light might change into a UFO. So my chapter on extraterrestrials was more about the contact experience. Obviously, you can't talk about that without talking about UFOs and flying saucers. But for the most part, I think that our Strange Lights chapter that Tim tackled is going to be the main place for that to show up in Volume 2, the actual Bigfoot seeing outside structured craft. In this book, it's about Bigfoot seeing inside structured craft, but the next one's Bigfoot seeing outside structured craft. That was just the arbitrary way that we had to try to wrap our arms around this giant data set. Yeah,
it may or may not be 2 chapters in Volume 2. I'm kind of punching it up now and getting it ready. It may be... It's basically mystery lights, all the orbs and all the other lights associated with Bigfoot, and then it's Bigfoot seen in conjunction with UFOs. And again, Josh tackles Bigfoot seen inside of UFOs in his chapter. So that's basically how we broke it up. And then so the majority of the light phenomenon stuff is going to be tackled in Volume 2.
Right, and
but of course it's mentioned all over Volume 1 too. It's so hard to separate this stuff. It's so intertwined.
Right, but there's also the association of Bigfoot with anomalous lights too. That's very much a part of it. And Tim, you've seen some stuff that is very similar to a lot of what people have seen that have gone to places that are said that Bigfoot is there, and you've ended up seeing lights.
Oh yeah. A couple different places. And I've been with I've been with people, where we're looking at the same lights, and the guy I'm with is saying, well, that's Bigfoot's eyes. And I'm saying, I don't know. I don't know what that is. It's just a weird light. And he's, insisting it's Bigfoot's eyes. So I go back and forth. Mostly I land on weird light. I don't know what it is, but then I'll talk to, like, I had a witness come on my show, Jeremy from Texas, and he saw, pretty much described exactly what I saw as far as the lights at Site 7, except that he saw them in the silhouette of a creature. So he's, to him, 100% sure, these are Bigfoot eye glow. And it's a weird thing to talk about, eye glow. This is not eye shine. And Jeremy, in fact, saw the lights change color in the silhouette of the creature. So he saw a big, black silhouette with self-illuminating eyes that changed color. So that is not eye shine. That's some kind of weird eye glow. and he's a great witness, 100% sure what he saw. And again, whatever he described sounds exactly like the lights I'm seeing at that place we call Site 7. Now, whether it's the same thing or not, I don't know, but it certainly sounds like that. But I go back and forth as to what they are. Certainly we can say weird lights tend to show up in the same place that people say they say Bigfoot. We can say that much.
Right. That's the anomalous lights in Bigfoot.
And speaking to Tim, having seen these lights himself, part of the reason that I think that this works really well is because, I have a real deficit in my own research in terms of field work. Just for various different reasons, I haven't really had a good place, or more specifically, I hadn't really had a good partner to go out with, because I think doing this alone is kind of ill-advised, going out to strange places. But anyway, I was actually, ironically enough, before the lockdown, I actually was going to get together with Jerry Ablin to go to some places that we decided. We'll still do that at some point. Anyway, I think that
you and Jerry going out squatch hunting is pretty scary, man. You guys be careful.
I know, right?
Yeah, really.
Yeah. If I don't show up and Jerry does, it's up. But I think that's part of the reason that this book works really well, is because Tim really does compensate for some of my own failings, and the fact that he invited me to be a part of this is very humbling, and I appreciate it to no end.
What about hairy extraterrestrials?
Well, it's interesting, because some of these things that people were seeing around the mid-century in France, and especially to this day in South America, are described in such a way that sound like these Littlefoot creatures that I talk about, these tiny little Bigfoots, these short, hairy dwarves, which correspond to a lot of ancient and modern fairy sightings. I mean, people talk about brownies as if they're some sort of little person, and you can find some evidence for that. But brownies were really more lobbed in with this brownies, bogles, goblins, that sort of tradition, which almost exclusively presents these creatures as small, hair covered, and having a simian appearance. Oftentimes, they're really compared directly to monkeys. So you do have those sort of hairy extraterrestrials being like one of the most prominent sort of visitors that you see in these craft. We tend in America to think that people are still just seeing alien greys, but people see all manner of things, including hairy dwarves, and that's something that I talk about a little bit in the book.
Doesn't Strieber talk about hairy dwarves being a part of his contact experience?
I'm not sure if he talked about dwarves. He definitely talked about things that he still calls the kobolds, which you had addressed earlier, which weren't necessarily explicitly hairy. They were just sort of little short blue critters. But I'm open to being wrong. I haven't an exhaustive recall of all of what these oeuvre.
Yeah, he had some the grays, and then he also had some little dwarf creatures. I can't remember if they were hairy or what they were. That's in Communion. I haven't read the rest of the material, but I do know that he does talk about that, and that's actually depicted in the film version of Communion.
Yeah, but I don't know if they were hairy, though. I don't know if they were hairy in that sort of hair covered sense, but I can totally be wrong.
Yeah.
Something I thought was interesting was where you're exploring the relationship between lore of witches and witchcraft and ghosts also, but this idea that where ghosts kind of in a physical appearance meet the Bigfoot phenomenon would be in there's a subsection of the chapter on witches that you call Goatia Squatches.
Yeah.
That really stood out to me. I think that's really cool.
Well, the big problem with so one of the best things that cryptozoology has going for it in terms of the possibility of Bigfoot being a relict hominid is that there are things in the fossil record that at least superficially represent what we would describe as Bigfoot today if we saw them. Probably, maybe, perhaps. It's conceivable, right? But you get to people that are talking about something like Dogman, and there ain't no way that anything that looks like that has any sort of precedent in the fossil record, nor is there any precedent for things like Goatman or Sheep Squatch, like some people call it. Mm-hmm. there sure as hell isn't any sort of precedent for something like Bat Squatch, which is a Bigfoot with bat wings.
It's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous.
It is.
Yeah.
Now I can say that's ridiculous and also not think that everybody's necessarily lying about that. I mean, I'm sure there are some people who are just, kind of going crazy. I'm just like, sort of joshing people and pulling the legs. But it occurred to me, and this is sort of an idea that Gordon White hit me to. You can kind of look at a lot of different cryptids as things that have some sort of vague precedent in the Goetia, in these sort of grimoires, these different books that teach you how to summon different spirits, and there are some rough correlations to things like Dogman. Obviously, Sheep Squatch sounds just like Baphomet, which wasn't technically a Goetic entity, I don't think, but still, the Sheep Squatch definitely ties into that sort of tradition of satyrs and fauns and how that got co-opted into our modern, associations of, the sabbatic goat with Satan. But also, there's if you squint your head and tilt, you can look at some descriptions of Beelzebub that sound like Bat Squatch, like these big leathery wings and this covered in hair. So it kind of makes me wonder, especially when you look at sort of the work that Tim does in his chapter on gifting that you've already addressed about how there's a ritual involved with some of these giftings, and
absolutely.
Also, Tim's work in Volume 2 about hex signs. It seems to me like maybe what we're looking at is not some sort of like traditional Lesser Key of Solomon style parade of spirits. And you look at the way that Bigfoot behaves. A lot of these Bigfoot encounters sound a lot like the way that people who are magical practitioners will tell you that spirits tend to manifest. They respond to invocations, vocalizations, and knocking on trees. They're more likely to manifest in areas of lesser, human habitation. They show their presence through environmental effects, like knocks and throwing rocks and stuff. And you often get a sensation of them being felt more than more than they're seen. I mean, even people who are flesh and blood, advocates will say that, sometimes you just feel that they're in the area, and that's a one-to-one description, and something that we've had David Metcalf on the show, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so David was with us at Paramania back in 2019, which feels like 1,000 years ago.
People still did stuff.
Yeah, when people still did stuff. We all went to the weekend culminated in a visit to Expedition Bigfoot in Cherry Log, Georgia, which is an absolutely fantastic museum of all sorts of Bigfoot ephemera. And it's interesting because I've gotten to know the owner of the museum, David Becara, and he's talks to me constantly about how people are coming to Expedition Bigfoot, this Bigfoot museum, and they're sharing their stories. And he says I'm getting all these stories from right around here, and it's just, I guess we put it in a hot spot. But Metcalf is the one that said, well, this place kind of functions as a temple to Bigfoot. Mm-hmm. And it's like, oh wow, you really turned that on its head. I just couldn't. You've got sacred relics there that are left by the phenomena. You've got a place for believers to come and people to be converted. It's in a place of power. Right? There are Bigfoot sightings in North Georgia, and it's almost like by putting a focal point for this phenomena, it's actually encouraged the phenomena to manifest even more. Which was just like an idea that just made my brain explode.
Look at all the people that go there every year, and the people that put their intention and believe in Bigfoot so much, and all of a sudden they start having sightings of him crossing the road and all this kind of different these different phenomenon happening. It's like the intention creates, just like a tulpa, essentially.
Yeah. No, I mean, if you talked to me about that, if you presented that idea to me 10 years ago, I would have just thought it was the goofiest thing ever, but it's so parsimonious and makes so much sense. And even if it's not actually what's going on, it's a great thought experiment.
Right. And there's other things in that chapter about ghosts, about the bulletproof Bigfoot, like you mentioned before, and phasing in and out of existence, invisibility, people talking about how Bigfoot will show up or will just disappear right in front of their eyes. All these kind of things. And there was one story that really got me, and that was about the floating hairy hands that would just like grab would like mess with people's cars and stuff like that. Yeah, you call it disembodied hairy hands.
Well, this is a perfect, example of something that is culturally dependent because, as I already addressed, you have hairy hands appearing in seances all the time. But there is no shortage of cases on the BFRO website that talk about this hairy hand that people assume is Bigfoot. Not seeing Bigfoot, they just see a giant hair-covered hand reaching in through a window or something to grab something. Now, of course, it's logical, especially given our cultural construct, to think that might be Bigfoot. But again, if you didn't see a Bigfoot, you can't definitively say it was a Bigfoot, especially when you're looking at the fact that there is this broad tradition of ghosts and poltergeists manifesting as hairy hands as well. And one of the most famous examples is this stretch of road in Devon in England that is just absolutely famous for people driving down the road and having these hairy hands, grab the wheel. Bigfoot, take the wheel. Having these hairy hands grab the wheel of your car while you're in your car. These disembodied hairy hands, and they're associated with possibly the death of a escaped prisoner, I believe. But it's something that is a very common phenomenon. I think the last one that I was able to find, I'm sure there have been more, but the last case that I was able to find was in 2008. Someone had these large hairy hands grab the wheel while they're driving down the car.
Make sure to buy my bumper sticker, Disembodied Hairy Hands Are My Co-Pilot.
Love it. But yeah, it's just another one of those things that is entirely cultural dependent, and that's sort of where I found a lot of inspiration for writing this, was just to cast just one little sliver of doubt into people's minds over whether or not well, we say it's Bigfoot because that's what our culture tells us, but it could be a lot of things, or it could be Bigfoot could be all these things. Bigfoot could be just another mask that whatever this non-human other intelligence decides to put on from time to time.
Going back to the gifting, because we didn't get to talk about what exactly people will offer things, material, food, whatever, to Bigfoot. But then, Tim, what does Bigfoot give back in return?
Any number of things. So, sometimes people leave food and they will get dead animals in exchange. Presumably, Bigfoot offering what Bigfoot eats in exchange. They'll get a headless mouse or a dead bird or something. Sometimes they will get things like stones or feathers or little toys that seem like they've broken toys that seem like they've been in the woods or parts of statues and different items they get in returns. So it can be any manner of things, found objects. Often they're natural items, whether they feathers, bones, stones, etc.
What Tim, through your field work, do you have any advice for someone who wants to start interacting with this, but thinks it may be more non-material or like all the things you guys are talking about?
Folklore is explicit in its rules, and this kind of dovetails into something I'd like to say whenever we talk about this book, that folklore is a term that I've heard the flesh and blood folks use with disdain over the years, as in, oh, that's just folklore, in regards to something, and by this I think they mean folklore is equal to fiction. I like to point out that it absolutely is not. Folklore may be exaggerated, and it may be the most outrageous elements of the stories are preserved, but there's a reason why the stories exist. And as a folk singer who learned folk music in a fairly traditional way, the folk process is something that happens, and things are handed down. And there's a reason why we have a saying that bad songs don't get to become traditional. So there's only the good songs survive, and there's a reason why these folk stories survive. And it was our ancestors' way of telling stories, like, this is how we deal with these other things, capital O, other. Mm-hmm. And the rules are pretty explicit. So that if someone's wanting to embark on this, I would advise them to be cautious, to be courteous, and to be careful. And as best they can, observe the rules of folklore. For instance, they will tell you that if you are given something, especially if you ask for it, do not refuse it. And I have my own experience with this where I refused it, and I had some very, very negative things that followed. So there are many explicit rules in folklore that tell you how to deal with these things. And I simply don't have time to go over all of them here, but most of them are common sense. Most of them have to do with politeness and being respectful to others, both capital O and lowercase o, others.
So let's get into witches. I wrote it down as hairy and otherwise, and their similarity to Bigfoot, because this is not a subject that you would think would be even remotely have anything to do with Bigfoot, but somehow the folklore ties in to Bigfoot. And I want to kind of ease this in because I think that these go together into these women in white stories.
Yeah, I don't know what hit me to think of Bigfoot through the witch lens, but there's something there. I'm not really sure. There was a great encounter that was shared with Seth Breedlove in the Minerva Monster documentary, his first one, where there's a witness who's talking about meeting a friend who says, "Oh, there's a hairy witch that lives out back," and they ran into the Minerva Monster, and I was like, "Hairy witch, huh? Hairy witch." And it sort of ended up yielding some interesting fruit. There are some native traditions that talk about. By the way, for anybody who's wondering, we try to pinpoint every tribe that we can. We're not treating Native Americans as a monolith. We try to pinpoint every tribe by name whenever we can, just so we're not saying like Native Americans say this. There are but having said that, off the top of my head, there are some Native American traditions that explicitly describe Bigfoot as humans who are magical practitioners. And then if you look into sort of the European folklore, there is a direct, prominent conflation of the wild woman, which is, the female counterpart to the wild man, the wild woman with witches. And there's also a very strong correlation in European folklore of witches being hairy, witches having beards, witches, not only having beards and being hairy, but also gaining power from being hairy. And so from that, it just sort of all snowballed out of control. You'll find stories of witches who are bulletproof. You'll find, descriptions of Baba Yaga as being this, Baba Yaga, the Russian witch of Russian folklore, as being tall and covered in hair. This sort of ties into the idea that there's, also this conflation between tall, hairy hominids and skinwalkers. Well, this is kind of an explanation for that. As skinwalkers are human beings that have basically sold their soul to have magical properties, then it makes sense why in some traditions skinwalkers would be described as human warlocks, and people would also describe skinwalkers as tall, hairy hominids. It provides some connections in there. Sometimes in some traditions Bigfoot were ascribed having hypnotic powers by rubbing their bodies with a strange medicine, a strange, ointment or material. That's exactly how European witches would fly. It had nothing to do with a broomstick. It often had to do with grotesquely enough, making a jelly out of a fetus or something, and then rubbing their body with it.
There's some thought that some of that could have been hallucinogenic, that flying was a metaphor. I've heard that. Yeah.
Now, in case anybody's wondering, we're not talking about like modern practitioners of magic who call themselves witches. This is the archetypal witch. But there are a couple of modern connections here and there that speak to this connection that we don't even realize that we've internalized. I mean, the number of people who describe Sasquatch crying and sounding, screaming and sounding like a witch. And I thought it was a witch. Oh, it sounded like a witch and a gorilla. This is a description that comes up time and again. And there are actually a handful of encounters where people describe Bigfoot as witches. There was actually an encounter that was shared to the Strange Familiars Facebook page today where somebody saw a Bigfoot and they're like, well, I never heard of Bigfoot, but my great-grandparents were convinced that there were witches in the woods. And I'm like, damn it, that would have been great to have included. But, and then there's this story, which is a little bit too long to get into, but a story from 1929 of Charlie Victor, who was basically wounded a boy that was apparently under the care of a female Bigfoot, and she spoke to him in his language and basically cursed him, which is something that
let me ask you a question about that story.
Yeah.
She speaks to him in a language called Douglas. I was not familiar with that.
Douglas is, there's technically not, if memory serves, so people forgive me, but I think the Douglas Indian tribe, it's not necessarily its own language, but it is its own nation. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So there is a Douglas First Nation that is in the Pacific Northwest. I think of British Columbia. I think, it's not. I'm not sure either if that's. I'm sure it is. It's probably an Anglicanized name. The Winnebago weren't the Winnebago. They were actually the Ho-Chunk, that sort of thing.
When I was trying to look it up, some Bigfoot websites came up, and it said that was one thing that Bigfoot will speak in this language.
Yeah, but you've heard. I mean, I've heard people say that they recognize, Bigfoot as being anything from Russian to Japanese to made up languages that don't exist. That I go into this in sort of the Volume 2 is when I talk about vocalizations and mimicry. I mean, there's plenty of cases of Bigfoot straight up talking to people. But there are also examples like the Sierra Sounds where people pick out like a word here and there that kind of sounds familiar, and it's basically like, some sort of, I think it's some sort of auditory pareidolia is what people are getting, kind of like EVPs. So
this story with the witch and the boy.
Well, now it never says a witch, but it's a wild woman who comes out and puts a curse on him. And again, curses are one of those things you never talked about fairies because they would curse you. You never offended the fairies because they would curse you with death. And that's something that there are very prominent cryptozoologists who would say that no such thing as a Bigfoot curse exists because they're very invested in the flesh and blood hypothesis. But I sort of go through and point out why the examples that this individual cites as not being evidence are actually, to the contrary, quite suggestive that there's evidence that the act of speaking about or offending Bigfoot kind of does have some repercussions in some cases. There was an expedition. Well, I'm getting a little bit off track, but there was a newspaper account of an expedition rather through the Rockies that I found where the individuals basically slaughtered a tribe of Indians who were covered in hair, and I think like maybe a third of the people came back alive, and like half of those were crippled for the rest of their lives. So there does seem to be something there. In this case, she cursed Charlie Victor that he would never kill a bear again, and he was paralyzed. He ended up being paralyzed. The witness ended up being paralyzed 15 years later, and this particular cryptozoologist said, "Well, the curse doesn't make any sense. There is no curse in this case because he was paralyzed 15 years later." And I'm like, "Yeah, but she didn't say she was going to paralyze him. She said that he wouldn't shoot a bear, and that happened immediately. Like, you can't, So there's some playful interpretation that some people like to do to sort of further their own agenda, I feel like. But yeah, their Bigfoot curses are a thing. And then you sort of have to unpack, the depiction. I mean, there's a direct line of ancestry, folkloric ancestry. There's a direct chain. This is not debated by anyone because it's basically a commonly held belief amongst folklorists that satyrs and fauns sort of evolved. They were sort of a direct antecedent to the wild man archetype, which in itself sort of branched out into interpretations of Satan, because you had the demonification, the demonization rather of pagan rituals. So obviously, if they're cavorting with fauns and satyrs, those must be demons. That's why we get demons with cloven hooves and goat heads. That's why Satan has cloven hooves and goat heads. But the Satan Wildman thing is a really close relationship as well. And to the extent that Wildmen, specifically apes, were used as a symbol of man's sin. In a lot of Renaissance art.
Satan is described as God's ape and all kinds of stuff like that. Yeah.
And so even in some like art, there's like an ape in the Garden of Eden, representing the original sin waiting to jump at the chance. So it really is this big like interconnected pot of like satyrs and fauns and Dionysus and the Green Man and Satan and the Wild Man, and out of that sort of comes Bigfoot himself. And there are cases there's at least one case of cloven-hooded Bigfoot, the 1913 Traverse Spine Gorillas case in Labrador, Canada. So it's just an interesting. I actually have a It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia style like conspiracy board that I drew out on some cardboard about like all these different intersections. I mean, Tim alluded to us leaving cookies and milk out for Santa Claus. I mean, it's also a pretty widely accepted matter of European folklore interpretation that Santa Claus, while borrowing Saint Nicholas, the church figure, is basically an evolution of the Wildman archetype. So sort of a combination of the Wildman archetype and Odin, who shares his own etymological origins with the Wodwos, which was kind of like a big, tall, hairy fairy or a wild man.
Odin may be the wild man anyway. He may be the original archetypical wild man.
And Santa hangs out with elves. Like so, there you can draw all these robust like almost Jungian sort of correlations and relationships that just, I think that's part of the reason that when people have gotten the book after listening to so many interviews, they look at it and they're like, oh, this is a lot better than your interviews, because you kind of have to see it all laid out at once to really sort of start to wrap your head around.
Sure. I mean, you can't do justice to it in an hour and a half interview. You got to read the book.
It's hard to weave it together in the book. It's nigh impossible to weave it all together in an interview.
Yeah.
The women in white. Now, this is one of the most fascinating aspects of this book.
May I give my usual preface, Tim?
Sure.
I thought Tim Renner was full of it when he came to me and said, "Yeah, man, there's this connection between cryptids and women in white." I'm like, "What the heck are you talking about?" And he talked about Aaron David and Kelly's sighting of this devil monkey, which I'm like, okay, it's a one-off. It's a white thing that they saw that's kind of simian. But I'll be damned if he didn't start pulling on this thread, and just everything, absolutely everything, just started spilling out. And of course, the women in white, like you said, has associations with witches, but also fairies. I mean, the banshees were often women in white. It's an archetype that is somehow wedded to this Bigfoot thing, and I don't know what it means, but Tim is right, and this is something that I can confidently say that no one has ever broken apart. So kudos on you, Tim. That's amazing.
Well, this started with real world Bigfoot boots on the ground research. Well, it started with Sasquatch Chronicles. They have this amazing story of these two brothers that were seeing Bigfoot creatures, and then they started seeing this weird woman in white entity. But after that, I started seeing it in real world investigations. So I'm talking to Bigfoot witnesses, and it's coming up. Local Bigfoot witnesses are coming up. Like they're having one guy had Bigfoot on his property, and then I went out there to investigate the Bigfoot, and then before I go, he tells me, well, I also have ghosts and stuff, and he starts showing me all these pictures, some of which look like just ghostly figures and faces that he was saying were bikers. They were the ghosts of bikers, but I saw them as very much looking like Bigfoot faces, big hairy. He was seeing them as sunglasses. I was seeing them as big eyes, and these like very ghostly kind of figures. But along with this he showed me a picture of a full-bodied apparition that he had taken in the mirror, a picture in the mirror of, and it was a woman in a white dress. So I started following that away, and I'm going on these other Bigfoot investigations. One of them is an area called Pond Bank around here, which is next to Michaud Forest, which is probably your number one place in Pennsylvania for Bigfoot sightings. And I met a witness out there who had heard me talking a little bit about the women in white and Bigfoot thing, and he put it together in his own head that his sighting was, a Bigfoot sighting a mile away from this place called Pond Bank. Not even a mile, probably 3/4 of a mile from this place called Pond Bank. Pond Bank has a woman in white legend associated with a ghostly woman in white that appears there. I interviewed him on Strange Familiars, by the way. In the background, you can hear something very, very deep moaning throughout our interview. It's very creepy. I call it the Pond Bank groan. Sounds like people have compared it to like a tube and throat singers, or which I did not hear while I was interviewing him. By the way,
that's weird.
Yeah.
Well, interjection. That seems to be a significant sound that is described in other literature, and actually described in two other really reputable sources that I can think of, and that gets addressed in Volume 2 under Altered States.
So from here, it was just a matter of me sort of like, okay, so I'm going to start looking this up. And I was only looking in modern cases at first, and then I started to look in folklore and, in history. And I'm kind of going back, and I started finding some stuff, and then I found Perchta, this entity from Germanic folklore. Some say she's a moon goddess, but others say she doesn't really qualify as a goddess. She's just one of these sort of folkloric figures, kind of like the German equivalent of Baba Yaga, probably. She's this kind of witchy woman in the woods, and they said she always wore white. She could appear as an old hag or as a young maiden, and some of the legends have her with one or both feet being gigantic swan's feet. Now, Josh has cleverly pointed out that if you look at a swan's foot or any kind of bird track, it would appear to be three-toed. Now, we have, multiple cases of Bigfoot encounters with creatures leaving three-toed tracks and three-toed track finds. Now, that's all very interesting, but this Perchta entity was known to have an affinity for children like Bigfoot. She's, would call from the woods like Bigfoot, et cetera, et cetera. But then you get to her, the company she keeps, say, and she has this retinue consisting of two groups, and the one is the Heimchen, which were the souls of the dead children that she called off into the wilderness and never returned. And these souls of the dead children took the form of will-o'-the-wisp lights. So here you have the orbs, which are associated with the Bigfoot phenomenon. And the other group that followed Perchta around was the Perchten. And they were a group of hairy wild men that came from the mountains and would do things like throw stones at houses and harass people in the towns and so forth. So we have an explicit collection between this folkloric woman in white entity, this kind of witchy woman, and what for all accounts are these hairy wild men.
And to interject here as well, like the Perchten were not only just wild men, but sometimes in some traditions they were sort of depicted as similar to Krampus, which looks like a satyr or a faun, which ties into this whole big soup of satyrs, fauns, wild men, Bigfoot, the devil, etc.
Yeah, and from that point it was just a matter of like fanning out the folklore, and it really goes across the world, at least across Europe and Africa. There's folkloric figures in Germany and in the Norse and in Russia and Africa and Southern Europe that are these various wild men that they will say that either their wife or their female counterpart, it depends on the folklore, is either a woman in white, just explicitly would say like it's a woman who wears white, or they will say it's a white creature that goes along with them. And there's wild men in England that are associated. The apple tree man who has he guards the orchards, but he is aided in this by this, old crone who wears white. There's the Lishi, I believe. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. Basically the Russian wild man, protector of the forest. His wife wears white. So you find it all over. I haven't found anything in the Far East yet, but I'm sure it's there. It's just a matter of uncovering it, because it's all over. It's in folklore all over. These creatures, these wild men from all these different cultures have a significant other that is a woman in white. It's a very bizarre thing, but it's borne out by the folklore.
And even in one of the most famous cases of Bigfootery, Sasquatchology, I guess you could call it, there is a kind of proverbial woman in white. And this case, the Ape Canyon case is kind of like the Roswell of the Bigfoot material. It's kind of the beginning of it.
Yeah, it's certainly one of the most oft referred to cases from history. Like if you just got a generic Bigfoot book, that was like kind of a survey of Bigfoot, chances are they would have this case in it. But every account I've ever read, other than Fred Beck's own account, now Fred Beck was one of the miners in this case, has been completely weirdwashed. And they've taken out all the strangeness associated with it, and they present only the aspects of the story which make it sound like there was a bunch of monkeys in the woods. Mm-hmm. It's a very strange case that starts with these miners encountering what they call the ghost of a giant Indian. Now, how giant and what he looked like, they don't go into too much, who tells them to follow a white arrow through the sky. And they follow this white arrow. Along the way, they meet this other spirit. And they said this is female spirit who they named Vander White, or maybe she introduced herself. Now, they never describe her, but her name is actually Vander White. So here we have a spirit, at least with the name of White. And they end up naming their gold mine, the Vander White Mine, after this spirit. They're in residence in a cabin at this. And mostly the story you hear is that they take a shot at one of these creatures one day, and that night a group of creatures come and attack the cabin. But what they don't tell you is all the other strangeness around the case, not only these spirits and this white arrow in the sky, but things like finding 2 tracks in the middle of an acre-wide sandbar along the river with no indication of where it went to or from, just 1-2 tracks in the middle. I think one of the miners said it looks like something picked him up and sat him down and picked him up again. And they were hearing strange sounds coming from the ground, I think machine-like sounds and drumming. Fred Beck, the miner who later wrote about the case, said that he had a port of a pencil in his hand, which he was sure was at his house. He needed a pencil one day and just appeared in his hand. So there's all this other strangeness associated with the case, which is just completely left out. It's completely weirdwashed in all these other accounts in favor of making it sound like gorillas in the woods. And Fred Beck himself had a quote where he said, in no way did he or the other miners think that it was a natural creature at all. It's actually, he said, first of all, I will say that they are not entirely of this world, they being Bigfoot. I know the reaction we experienced as these beings attacked our cabin impressed many with the concept of great ape-like men dwelling in the mountains, and I can say that we genuinely fought and were quite fearful, and we were glad to get out of the mountains. But I was, for one, always conscious that we were dealing with supernatural beings, and I know the other members of the party felt the same. So that's in the 1960s. He was writing that account, remembering. He wrote it with his son, I think, in the 1960s, remembering this account in the 1920s. So he himself, he's the witness. He's the guy who wrote the story, and he said himself there was something supernatural about these. We didn't think they were natural creatures, at least as far back as the 60s. So, again, if we're going to believe witnesses, which we have to, because without witnesses, we really have nothing other than a few casts to go by. So if you're going to believe witnesses, you can't say, oh, I believe the witness saw a giant ape man, and then throw out everything else the witness says. That's crazy. It's just not a good thing to do. It's not truthful. So
we all live in glass houses, right?
Yeah, yeah. Brett
There's
Beck
also
himself said there was more to it, so I say there's more to it.
there's also a correlation to the women and to the lady in white. You talk about Chickamauga Battlefield, which I'm right down the street from at the moment. I'm not that far away, and that's another one where you have this kind of dichotomy between the lady in white or the woman in white and some weird creature.
There's a woman in white who carries a weird light as well. They say it's this supposed woman in white who swings a lantern as she crosses the battlefield. So she has your weird light, and then they had this old green eyes entity that's associated with it, which tales supposedly that during the breaks in the battle there that these big hairy, they called them ghouls, were coming out and eating the bodies of the dead Confederate soldiers or carrying them off. I forget which. Mm-hmm. But to this day, people claim to see this old green eyes entity, which many say is Bigfoot, and descriptions vary. I think the description in the book is something very weird. It sounds like a Bigfoot creature with a cape on or something. I think that one of the guys who worked at the park, witnessed this. But Gettysburg has it too. Battlefields and Bigfoot go together, but so do battlefields and women in white. So they share this common ground.
It really, I mean, so stuff like the Chickamauga Old Green Eyes and the Women in White and the Light. I mean, it's just these stories keep on appearing so often, and it really starts to look like these are just these overlays that we have. It's the same suite of phenomena, and just depending on whatever we encounter, you get the woman in white looking for her lover's body with a lamp, or you get a hairy creature, or you get an anomalous light in the sky that's zipping around, or you get something that looks like a fairy. I mean, it really seems like it's just the same thing over and over again. It's almost like every story is the same, but what mask it decides to wear is just it just depends. It just depends on the person, and depends on the culture, and it depends on the time, and it depends on all these other factors.
Right. Yeah. The existence of the other taking on the form that I believe it thinks that it wants us to see, something that's very culturally specific.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know if we explicitly talk about this in either volume, but one of the ideas that we kind of bat around as we've been talking about this, and it's apt in the comparison to that we talk about the UFO phenomenon, the Bigfoot phenomenon, and the flesh and blood hypothesis, and the nuts and bolts hypothesis, etc. The ETH stuff. The wild man archetype itself seems to change. So we have in medieval times this Wadwos, who they were often wizards, which is a form of knowledge and wisdom. These were ascribed to the wild men, and then working up into the 1800s, where I've uncovered a lot of articles which seem to show what I think to be Bigfoot, or the same things people describe as Bigfoot today. And in the 1800s, there's a lot of articles which describe these wild men, otherwise, big hairy things. They don't appear to be human, but maybe they're wearing clothes. And previous to starting these volumes, I kind of thought, well, maybe this is the Victorian prudishness, where these editors are throwing clothes on these creatures, as far as in the article, despite what the witnesses were saying, just because of, people couldn't handle the idea of a naked wild man running around in the woods. But as we're talking about this, and we talk about how UFOs change over time. In the late 1800s, they were airships. They looked like dirigibles and so forth that people were seeing. And then UFOs changed to this more like 50s kind of sci-fi ships, and they keep evolving. I think post Star Trek and Star Wars, you get a lot of giant crafts with all kinds of tech and stuff on them, and then up until today, where people seem to be seeing like plasma balls and so forth. Well, the wild man archetype, I think maybe that's been changing too. Maybe it was a hairy guy partially clothed. Some of those old 1800s articles have him even carrying rusty muskets that refuse to fire. But they're identifiable as muskets that they're carrying around, like the remnants of these partially wild beings. They're not fully wild, and this kind of idea we've batted around is maybe the archetype itself has changed over time, just like UFOs have changed. And as UFOs have seemed to get more like technical, they get more like sci-fi and more advanced. It's like the wild man has gotten wilder over time, and perhaps as we've gotten further away from wilderness and more, into our homes and cities and dependent upon modern technology and so forth, our wild man perhaps has gotten wilder, and we have this very, very wild Bigfoot right now as our wild man.
And we do talk about that briefly in I can't remember where, but we do in volume 2.
It's in volume 2? Okay.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I remember writing that.
I can't think of anything more popular right now in the paranormal than Bigfoot. Bigfoot is probably the most popular one at this very moment.
Well, we're ready to blow it up.
Well, I think we talked about this a little bit. I think we talked about this a little bit before the Strange Realities conference, but it's almost like Bigfoot as forest guardian. Bigfoot as forest guardian is kind of stepping up as we're making Earth, more and more difficult to live on. It's almost like the archetype of the forest guardian Bigfoot is coming forward to sort of save the day. It kind of has a little bit of that feel. Not that I literally believe that, but I think it's interesting that, Bigfoot is like the most naturalistic of all paranormal phenomena that you can get at, besides something like fairies. But he's on a resurgence at a time when we seem to have painted ourselves into a corner environmentally.
That's a really good point, Josh. That's a really good point. Idea of the idea of the return to the land, what that spirit represents. Yeah. And I've also noticed that Bigfoot also serves the purpose of people getting out into nature and using it as an excuse. It's almost become its own kind of like extreme sport in a way.
Yeah.
Raphael, was there anything that you wanted to ask?
Well, one thing I just wanted to point out, how beautiful the book is itself with all Tim's artwork and everything. And that, I just have a digital copy right now to read for the show, but I plan on definitely getting a physical copy because I'm sure it looks really nice, on actual paper. It's a piece of art itself.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah. One of the things I wanted to do, there's a certain look old folklore books had, and they were just really nice to hold, and that was one of the things I wanted to do with this. Is I was like, I want to kind of have that feeling of those great old folklore books. I didn't illustrate it in the same way that I illustrated, say, Don't Look Behind You, the book that I wrote by myself, just because I think there's so much information in here that the information has to present itself in a way. So I did, chapter masthead illustrations, and I did like one big frontispiece for it, and I do little spot illustrations at the end of each chapter to just kind of set the mood a little bit. But what I really wanted was to sort of call to mind those old folklore books that I love so much. I know Josh does too, that we spent so much time digging through as we prepared this volume. So I greatly appreciate that. Thank you for saying that. I tried to make it look nice.
Yeah,
it looks great.
We sort of parsimoniously landed on a representation of the table of contents that really, with listing each individual section underneath the chapters, that I think really harkens back to this old folklore books too. Also, it's sort of a way, some people might open this book and be like, well, where do they talk about bulletproof Bigfoot? And part of the challenge was to nest certain anomalies about Bigfoot in certain chapters. So there's not a chapter on invisible Bigfoot, but all the invisible Bigfoot stuff went into the ghost chapter. There's not a chapter on interdimensional Bigfoot, but it went into this chapter. Bulletproof Bigfoot went into this chapter, just to have a place to sort of to nest things. But also something that I think it's worth repeating, and I'm going to start repeating it from here on out. The ebook is available, but if you buy the ebook, I honestly don't recommend buying the ebook because you lose so many of these illustrations that Tim has put into it. You lose a lot of the typesetting that he's done with the font, and I think that I think that it functions best as a what I've been describing as a lovely artifact in that ARTEFACT sort of way. It's a lovely, like, it just feels nice to have it. I say that not having it, but I know it will. I still haven't got my copy yet. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you guys. This has been awesome. Guys, tell everybody where they can find each one of you. Josh, tell them where you find your books, where they can get this book, and Tim, tell everybody about Strange Familiars, which oddly enough is a title of a section in this book.
Go ahead.
I like how you did that, Josh.
Yeah, I was deliberate. You can find out all about me if you're that much of a masochist at joshuacutchin.com. And you can find links to all my books, including the ones that I've just been a contributor to over there as well. A Trojan Feast, The Brimstone Deceit, Thieves of the Night, and then 2 collections of essays that I contributed to, as well as Where the Footprints End, Volume 1, Folklore, Bigfoot, High Strangeness, and the Bigfoot Phenomenon. Yeah.
All right, cool. And Tim?
You can find me and Strange Familiars podcast at strangefamiliars.com. All the links there go to me. You can find links to things like my Etsy shop there, where I sell original artwork. Been selling artwork from my other books and stuff. You can find all my books on Amazon. You can order them from me usually. I'm waiting for restocks of my books, including this Where the Footprints End. You can order them directly from me if you want signed copies, but you can get them on Amazon as well. You can look up either Timothy Renner or look up the titles of any of the books. There's 5 of them now, including this one with Josh. And like I said, everything else is at strangefamiliars.com. So check it out, and you can hear the podcast there as well.
Both you guys are really prolific, and you guys doing this is like I think you guys magnum opus. So I'm so really happy that you guys are doing this. Mm-hmm. You guys are going to do a Patreon with us. We're going to talk about a little bit more some aspects and maybe get you guys a little bit some rowdy entertainment with these guys. But
just to mention real quick, Volume 2. I know everyone always asks when is Volume 2 coming. The aim is before the end of the year. We'll see.
Excellent. Excellent.
Things have delayed us before, but that's the aim. We're hoping before the end of the year.
Excellent. Cool. Excellent. All right. We're going to close out the show, guys. We're going to do it this way. Please remember our Patreon, and you guys can join for as little as $1. We're going to have these guys do a little Patreon segment for us. And Serfiel, tell everybody where they can find that.
You can find it on patreon.com/conspirinormal, or you can also make a one-time donation at conspirinormal.com. And like Adam said, we've been putting out bonus content every week, so we should have something cool every week for you.
Absolutely. And if you feel free, leave us some more, because it really helps us. It really helps us get the show out there. Really helps us with the cost of doing it. And also, if you cannot do that, please leave us a good review on iTunes, and also subscribe to the YouTube channel, which is under Conspirinormal Podcast. All right, guys. Josh, Tim, thank you so much for being part of this special episode of Where the Footprints End on Conspirinormal.
If you would like to help the show, please consider becoming a Patreon at www.patreon.com/conspirinormal, or leave a one-time donation at conspirinormal.com. And please check out our YouTube channel, Conspirinormal Podcast.